June 18, 1815, is destined to be a day that will go down in history forever. On this day, in Waterloo, a little-known town in Belgium, a battle that decides the fate of an empire is going on. Since the early morning, the French army has been fighting to the death with the Anglo-Dutch coalition forces. In just a few hours, tens of thousands of people have been bloodied on the battlefield. Hundreds of cannons were roaring non-stop, as if they were conveying the roar of God. The smoke and dust mixed with blood filled the battlefield for dozens of miles, making everything seem so illusory. The hero who claims to be overlooking the whole world is standing on the high ground next to Rossum village, looking down at the soldiers under his command with a blank expression, and launching an almost desperate impact on the British front again and again. He watched helplessly as tens of thousands of soldiers from all over France wearing Chinese and American uniforms fought battles for him. In his 20-year military career, he had long been accustomed to conquest and honor, danger and death, and such scenes were no longer worthy of his moving. But he still felt restless. He was the emperor of the French Empire, an unparalleled genius in the eyes of the soldiers, leading them to glory and splendor. Today, after repeated attacks but still unable to break through the line of defense set up by British commander Arthur Wellesley, he has vaguely felt that he can no longer give victory to the French today. God seems to be punishing his previous good fortune. The emperor paced restlessly. The time has come to sunset and dusk. At this time, a vague black shadow appeared on the horizon. Although it was quickly determined that the shadow was approaching, it was a marching army. "Is Grouchy here?" he muttered. He and the people around him look forward to it. It only needs good luck this time, just once. His Majesty the Emperor prayed secretly in his heart. However, after just a few more minutes, his hands and feet stiffened from disappointment. That army carried the Prussian eagle flag. There are tens of thousands of legions rolling in, and in the evening when both armies are exhausted, it will be the decisive weight. And this weight is obviously going to be added to the British side. Albion people, you have won. There seemed to be an unquestionable verdict from the sky. The fighting continued, but the arrival of fresh Prussians was enough to decide everything. At this moment, even the most indomitable warrior couldn't help but be bound by fear, lost the courage to continue fighting in the fright, and couldn't help wailing at the inevitable defeat. The wailing sound was scattered at first, but it immediately resonated everywhere, and finally converged into an unstoppable torrent, wrapping the soldiers and fleeing in the opposite direction to the enemy. At first, officers tried to stop the flood of rout, but soon they found themselves powerless, and were even carried by the rout and fled back together. Although the front-line troops fled back, the entire battlefield collapsed, and soon even the emperor himself could not prevent the rout. The emperor and his entourage and staff watched it from the farm, and the younger officers wept in grief and indignation, cursing the cowards who escaped for ruining everything. The emperor himself just stood there, looking pale at the torrent of defeated soldiers, and said nothing. He did not blame the fleeing men. The French nation has fought for him until now, paid the blood of millions of people, and did not abandon him even when he was the most down, and still followed him to rise up again and come here. They have sacrificed enough, and no one can blame the French for not being loyal and brave enough. Emperor Napoleon slowly closed his eyes, savoring the pain he could never get rid of in his life. He is not suffering for himself. As early as a year ago, he has tasted the pain of being a prisoner, and it will not be the end of the world again. He can bear this pain. He is suffering for his heir. The child he brought into the world in order to inherit his career, the child he had high hopes for, the child who brought him countless joys. I can't leave him anything. The emperor, who has shaken Europe for 20 years and dominated Europe for 10 years, let out a helpless lament. Agron, I'm sorry, we have nothing left. equals 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 at dusk on this day, the dark golden sunlight dyed the land of Europe with blood, even the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. In a suite in the palace, the maids came and went anxiously, looking after a child lying on a hospital bed. He had blonde hair and was a little delirious from a bad cold, and there were large beads of sweat on his forehead. He is what the emperor called Aiglon, the crown prince of the French Empire and the king of Rome, Napoleon II, who was once destined to inherit Napoleon's cause. Now only 4 years old, he has a little understanding of the meaning of the words empire and emperor, but of course he can't know. Just today, his father has lost the entire empire, and he lost all the glory surrounding him. It was impossible for him to even see his father again. Last year, when Emperor Napoleon abdicated for the first time in 1814, at the invitation of the Austrian Emperor Franz, the French Empress, his daughter Louisa, came here on May 21 with her son. A royal palace in Austria, and has since become a crowned hostage. From then on, until Napoleon died of illness on the island in 1821, father, son, and husband and wife never saw each other again. Agran? Agran. The mother sitting at the head of the bed looked at her seriously ill son anxiously and called out from time to time. Since the first 2 days, her son has been suffering from a high fever, which the doctor said was even life-threatening. She didn't know medicine and could do nothing, so she could only sit helplessly by the bedside, lamenting the ruthless tricks of fate on her, and at the same time praying in her heart that everything would at least not get worse. As if answering her prayer, the child slowly opened his eyes, his blue eyes looking at his mother with a confused gaze. Agran, you finally woke up. Louisa, who still holds the title of queen in theory, no longer cares about the dignity of the royal family, and gently embraces her son. However, she would never have imagined that the soul left in this child's body at this moment was replaced by one during the high fever just now. Perhaps the scorching flames of the Waterloo battlefield made the soul of Napoleon's son unbearable. Didn't I just fall asleep in the library? Why did he suddenly change his place when he opened his eyes? Confused, Chu Ying was stunned to find that she seemed to have come to a completely unfamiliar world, which was obviously not China. Am I dreaming? This is where? Why am I here? Also, why can't I understand what they say? All kinds of questions came one after another, and he could no longer think about it, because the lady in front of him was grabbing his shoulders and shaking it gently. Wait, my body? How did I become a child? He was horrified to discover an even more terrifying fact. The pain left by the high fever in his body told him that all this was not a dream. Agran, are you all right? The lady dressed as a Western lady in front of her asked with a residual tear and a surprised smile. I'm fine. Confused and sleepy, he blurted out. The woman's face became a little distorted from surprise, and she looked at the doctor next to her in horror. God, save him, he's already talking nonsense. The doctor hurried over and carefully examined the child's body. Don't panic, ma'am. After a moment he looked at Queen Louisa. He has recovered, and he probably hasn't adapted to it yet. He just needs to sleep again. Is it really okay? Louisa was still in shock. It's okay, you see, his body temperature is already dropping. The doctor smiled in order to comfort her, and then pointed to his forehead. Queen Louisa raised her right hand and stroked her son's forehead. Thank God! She breathed a sigh of relief. It's much better. After speaking, she hugged her son again. Poor child. Chu Ying didn't say a word, just lay there blankly, feeling the embrace of the woman. He has realized that the current situation is absolutely abnormal. He should have passed through like the protagonist of the online novel. So the question is, where did you travel to? How is the world different here? It is impossible for a 4-year-old child to have any coherent memory and conscious judgment. All he can retrieve in his mind is a pile of fragmented pictures. But even with such a pile of fragmented memories, he was slowly able to piece together some details. Among the children's memories are the Tuileries Palace, the Fontainebleau, the crown, and the incomparably warm embrace, the embrace of the father. Father, OMG! It's that person! In the embrace of Her Majesty the Queen, Chu Ying opened her eyes wide and stared blankly at the gilt decoration on the ceiling. As an amateur European history buff, he certainly knows what all these details represent, and who he is now. The more important issue is that although the exact date is unknown, I is now 4 years old, which means that this is 1815, which was a disaster for the Bonaparte family. King of Rome, you and your father have just lost everything. Thinking of this, Chu Ying closed her eyes and let out a silent sigh, not knowing whether it was for the child or herself. The name of the Roman king is Napoleon Francois Joseph Charles Bonaparte, and Emperor Napoleon also gave him the nickname Aiglon, which means eagle. After arriving in Austria, on July 22, 1818, his maternal grandfather, Emperor Franz I of Austria, issued an edict to cancel his name as Napoleon and use the Germanized Franz as his new name. At the same time, he cancelled his King of Rome and all other titles, and made him Duke of Reichstadt. Therefore, at different times and occasions in this work, the characters will have different names for the protagonist. Please do not take offense to readers. Time flies, and in the blink of an eye came June 18, 1826, exactly 11 years later. During these 11 years, Europe has entered an era completely different from the previous turbulent 20 years, and very few major events have occurred. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon, who had lived in confinement for 6 years, died silently on the desolate island of St. Helena. On September 16, 1824, the emperor's old enemy, King Louis XVIII, who restored the Bourbon dynasty in France, also died contentedly in the Tuileries Palace. His younger brother, the Count of Artois, succeeded him. Throne of Charles X. Ancient Europe revived. The Bourbon Restoration dynasty, along with the 3 monarchies that formed the Holy Alliance Russia, Austria, and Prussia, was staunchly upholding the Orthodox monarchy, trying to make everything look exactly the same. The history of more than 20 years from 1789 to 1815 seems to have been written off, as if nothing has happened, and nothing has anything to do with Robespierre, Napoleon, and other annoying names. It seems that nothing can affect the luxurious, rich, quiet, and comfortable court life of Schönbrunn Palace. On this day, the warm breeze of early summer reverberated gently in the garden of Schönbrunn Palace. In the spacious garden, the geometric flower beds and lawns were as beautiful as ever. A blonde teenager strolled through this intoxicatingly mild and comfortable morning. He was wearing a plaid wool coat with a lapel collar, a turtleneck shirt, velvet breeches, and moccasins with silver buckles. These exquisite clothes, coupled with his handsome face, deserves to be a handsome young man. He walked slowly all the way, and finally came to the top of the height of the big garden. There is a large building here. This is the commanding height of Schönbrunn Palace, the Arc de Triomphe. Standing under the tall colonnade, overlooking the entire palace and garden, the young man said nothing, as if he was quietly contemplating. Logically speaking, this is the most vibrant time of the year, and his age is also the most energetic and splendid time in a person's life, but the expression on his face at this moment is too calm, making people unable to see the young man. He should have a high-spirited spirit, but instead has a melancholy temperament that is not commensurate with his age. However, if you are familiar with his identity, this will not be surprising. He is the unfortunate man who was ousted from the French throne, the heir to the man whose name cannot even be mentioned, and is now trapped in the country where his mother grew up, and he is rightly gloomy. However, no one could have imagined that the soul in this thin, light, and ancestral body had already been replaced once on that calamitous day. Now, after 11 years in a new identity, Chu Ying, or Agron, has become accustomed to the era she lives in, relying on the historical knowledge she has learned as a hobby when she is reading, and how people treat children his contempt. He perfectly concealed the secret that he came from another country and another era, and lived in this magnificent and beautiful Habsburg court with the title of Duke Lechstedt. However, he could not get used to this kind of life under house arrest no matter what. No matter how luxurious the birdcage is, it is still just a birdcage. Although it can no longer be compared with the extravagant pomp of the crown prince of the French Empire, in all fairness, the Habsburg Emperor did not detract much from his living conditions. He lacked everything here. Teachers also have a group of servants, however, only lack of freedom of action. He could only curl up in the palace of the Habsburg family, bathed in the glory of the royal family, and crawled as a hostage. In this unfree atmosphere, the poor Roman king in history only lived to be 21 years old and died of tuberculosis in 1832, and Chu Ying herself did not know how long she could hold on, or was driven mad. In order to dispel this resentment, from his childhood when he acquired his new identity, he forced himself to find other entertainment, read various books and newspapers, and eagerly learned all kinds of knowledge, and finally survived. When will this life end? The young man raised his head again, looking at the blue sky and white clouds above Schönbrunn Palace, wondering how many times he asked himself. In any case, you must escape, not for the glory of the Napoleon family or the glory of France, but to allow yourself the freedom you deserve. This luxurious palace must not be its own destination. It should be buried. The Busberg dynasty, not the successor of the French Empire. Your Highness. While he was still in a trance, a tall man in military uniform came over to him while saying hello. Agron retracted his gaze, and then looked at the man who was approaching. He was tall, with thick limbs and a square face, typical of a Germanic soldier, and he was Captain Foresti, a member of his own governess corps. After Agron reached the age of education, His Majesty Emperor Franz educated his grandson according to the practice of royal family members, and prepared a whole set of educational team for Agron, which has been around Agron for several years. He devoted all his money to teaching, carefully and earnestly educating him, cultivating his knowledge and due demeanor. Of course, in addition to teaching him aristocratic education, this team also had the task of turning Agron into a Germanized aristocrat, as well as monitoring himself nearby. This was tacitly understood by each other. Ignoring the point that no one can change, he gets along with them quite happily. Except for the occasional conflict in class due to different ideas, he can be said to be their proud disciple. At least Agron has this. Confident. Under his gaze, the man walked to his side and bowed respectfully to the boy. Are you meditating again? Shall we wait a little longer? The people around him have long been accustomed to him falling into a state of contemplation from time to time, and some even think that the melancholy His Royal Highness is more charming than usual. No, just staring at the scenery in a daze. Agron shook his head. Just start at the scheduled time. Okay. The captain nodded. Foresti was an officer in the Austrian Imperial Army. Although his rank was not high, he had considerable military experience. He was in charge of Agron's military education. It is worth mentioning that, in 1809, he participated in the Battle of Wagram between France and Austria, where he was seriously wounded and almost died. However, the captain never hated Napoleon or Agron because of this. In his view, it was only natural for soldiers to be injured in battle. He even had a vague admiration for Emperor Napoleon. Of course, it was only the admiration of soldiers for soldiers. The captain spread his hands, revealing the two practice swords he was holding. Then he handed the hilt of one of the swords to Agron. Yes, today and as always, they will be here for swordsmanship practice. For several years, in addition to strictly teaching Agron military knowledge, he also taught swordsmanship. He was a very good swordsman in the army. Learn swordsmanship from him, something Agron himself had strongly requested a few years ago. He knew that the historical Roman king was frail and sickly since childhood, and his early death was also related to this, so in order to avoid this bad luck, he decided to exercise from the beginning of his education. In order to allow the court to accept this request, he decided to use the practice of swordsmanship as an excuse. After all, this was more understandable and approved by the court than doing gymnastics or other fitness methods. His innocuous request was quickly agreed to by the court, so from then on, he began to practice with captains who were proficient in swordsmanship every day or two. Although the captain has paid great attention to restraint, in the beginning, almost every time he fell, he would be bruised and bruised. However, Agron didn't have any complaints. After every fall, he would grit his teeth and get up again, continuing the strict contact and refusing to slacken any slack. With the passage of time, his height has grown a little bit, and his movements have become lighter and more powerful. Even when two people are fighting, he has the ability to parry and counterattack, making great progress. The amazing willpower of His Royal Highness made the people in the palace amazed. Agron took a sword from the captain's hand, and as usual, the two of them took 2 steps back each, then saluted and put on a starting gesture. Agron narrowed his eyes slightly, stared at his opponent, and lowered his upper body slightly to adjust his breathing, while the captain seemed quite calm, just stood there and looked at his distinguished student, signaling him to attack. Agron leaned forward, then took a stride, raised his sword and stabbed him in the chest. The captain swung his sword to block, then twisted it hard, and then slashed diagonally. Agron stepped sideways, dodged the captain's attack, and stabbed him in the shoulder again between his movements. In this way, the two of them swung their swords into a fight, and Agron kept using his steps to keep attacking the opponent while he was moving. Captain Forresty, on the other hand, blocked his attacks with equanimity, firing back from time to time, allowing students to learn how to deal with them. The two kept moving, teetering between the columns, and Agron became more and more enjoyable as he fought. In this state of ecstasy, he no longer had to think about any troubles, he just needed to enjoy the excitement of competing with others. However, the troubles in the world could not leave him, not even this moment. "Can you please stop for a moment, Your Highness?" The two who were fighting fiercely heard a greeting from the side. Captain Forresty stopped first and quickly retreated, and Agron had no choice but to end his practice. He turned his head and found that the one who interrupted his yaxing was Count Maurice von Dietrichstein, the head of education beside him and the real guardian appointed by His Majesty the Emperor. The Count was thin and had a rather long face. At first glance, he was a rather serious man. He was knowledgeable and personable, and was even once a close friend of Beethoven. When in charge of Agron's education, he was very strict and abide by his duties, but the relationship between the two people was not bad. "Is something wrong?" Agron asked impatiently. "His Royal Highness, I'm sorry to disturb your yaxing." The Count also bowed slightly, "but now there is an important matter that makes me have to interrupt your practice ahead of time." "That's fine, it's okay." Agron replied with a clearly unhappy expression, "What the is going on?" "His Royal Highness Prince Metternich wants to see you," replied the Count. Metternich. The name, along with his prime ministership, was certainly enough to interrupt Agron's yaxing. His Royal Highness has no obligation to wait for him. "All right then." Agron didn't show any expression on his face, and didn't show his emotions to anyone. He handed his sword to Captain Forresty. "Thank you for your guidance. Your Highness, you have made great progress. Although you are not my opponent yet, I believe that you can surpass me with just a little more time." Captain Forresty's face was filled with pride that could not be concealed. "Although I only have you as a student, I think my judgment should be very objective." Agron looked at the captain. "It's always a pleasure to get along with pure soldiers. What's more, who doesn't like to hear compliments?" "Thank you," he replied lightly. There is no doubt that in the era opened in 1789, Napoleon was the most dazzling star among them. He shook the whole of Europe, and people named this era after him. However, he can't write the entire era alone. Outside of him, there are a group of stars that are a little dimmer but still dazzling enough. Together with him, they decorate the starry sky in Europe and write those legends that are either exciting or regrettable. Story. Prince Metternich is one of those stars. He is not a brave general, nor is he an expert in state governance, but he has superb diplomatic acumen and skills, as well as utilitarianism and ruthlessness hidden under his elegant demeanor, worthy of stirring Europe with other chess players' continental chess. At a time of crisis when Austria was continuously defeated by the Emperor Napoleon, he was appointed as the foreign minister by the Austrian Emperor. He used his flexibility to move around in a limited space, first respecting Napoleon and then declaring war on France when Napoleon defeated Russia. Vienna. During the meeting, they took advantage of the home field to make good use of the home field, sometimes showing goodwill to Russia, and sometimes showing goodwill to Britain and France. In recognition of his contribution, he has been the Prime Minister of the Austrian Empire since 1821, and His Majesty the Emperor has given him enough trust. Every word he utters represents the ancient Habsburg dynasty. At this moment, Agron and his guardian, Count von Dietrichstein, were preparing to enter a suite in Schönbrunn Palace to meet the Prime Minister. Just like before, Agron has been expressionless, his pace is not slow, and he never has the sincerity and fear of meeting such a big man. Although I was a little excited when I saw famous historical figures at first, but after seeing them a few times, I no longer have a similar feeling. Even Metternich was only a mortal, albeit an outstanding mortal. What's more, he is not a friendly existence to Agron. Soon, the door was opened. The room was very empty, except for a thin man standing with his hands behind his back, looking out the window. Under the guidance of the squires, Agron and the Count walked into the room, bowed to the Prime Minister, and then the squires withdrew with the Count. Agron stood in the center of the room, waiting for His Royal Highness's inquiry. He didn't wait long when Prince Metternich turned around and looked at him. And Agron also raised his head and looked at His Royal Highness. He was wearing a court-embroidered gown today, with a sash on his chest and a medal of honor around his neck, and the jewels were enough to make one forget that he was 50 years old. As usual, there was a ceremonial smile on his pale, wrinkled face, as if he were wearing a delicate mask. "Franz, I haven't seen you for a long time, and you've grown a lot taller, it's reassuring." He greeted softly and made a gesture for Agron to sit down. He is very kind, and although everyone knows that he is not kind, His Royal Highness must show kindness, and Agron must accept this kindness and show enough respect. On the boundary of Schönbrunn Palace, no matter how many swords there are, they must be covered with a veil of affection. "You are as radiant as ever." Agron smiled slightly and replied with the same politeness. 53 years old and 15 years old are incomparable. His Royal Highness replied softly, "The moment you entered the door, although I turned my back to you, I still felt the vitality, a sense of directness. A youthful, enviable vitality. At least you have lived up to your youth, and I have achieved nothing." Agron replied. Of course he knew that when Prince Metternich found him, of course it couldn't be just to say these boring compliments, but since the other party wanted to go around in circles, he could only continue to go around. "Then what do you hope to accomplish?" asked the prince suddenly. Then he smiled again. "Dominate Europe." It sounded like a joke, but Agron suddenly became nervous. In his current situation, he can't talk nonsense, especially when it comes to such a dangerous topic. "I don't have such fanciful fantasies, but I do hope to be a traveler and explorer in the future, giving myself the opportunity to see any interesting place in the world and leave manuscripts for the world's reference." Agron immediately answered, "For me, this is a dream far enough away. You don't have to be so discouraged, this dream is not without a chance to come true." Prince Metternich spread his hands, as if to comfort the young man. "Although your status is special, it will bring some concerns to all of us, but I believe that with the passage of time, one day, the sensitive past will become history, and everyone will no longer be entangled in the past, and on that day you can use the identity of the Habsburg family, in the sight of people's admiration. They have traveled to every corner of the world." It is true that these words are very pleasant, and even more touching under the gentle voice of His Royal Highness, but Egrin remains unmoved in his heart. Obviously, this is just a perfunctory drawing of a pie. When politicians say someday, that's what they mean by never possible in the foreseeable future. But he is not disappointed, these things are already known to him. Okay, thank you for your kindness. Egrin bowed again and thanked him. Is there anything you want to tell me? Actually, it's not a big deal. His Royal Highness shook his head gently. I paid attention to your studies recently, and the feedback I got was very good. Almost all of your teachers praised you, saying that you are both savvy and savvy. I am willing to work hard and make great progress. The teachers have taught me very carefully, and I have no reason to disappoint them. Egrin replied sincerely. Look, that's what I'm talking about. His Royal Highness interrupted the boy again. To be honest, it's hard to see your kind of hard work among the kings and grandchildren, because a life that is too rich and comfortable will always kill their will. They also have no motivation to push themselves to work hard. Your Highness Franz, you are different from them. No one with no ambition would push yourself like this. Egrin didn't answer for a while. Given his situation, no matter what the answer seems to be inappropriate. After all, having great ambitions is a somewhat dangerous assessment. His Royal Highness did not urge him to speak, but continued to speak on his own. I like young people to have some ideals, instead of lying in bed and sleeping in a hurry. But Franz, I think you need to accumulate further foundations for your ideals. What do you mean? Egrin had an ominous feeling in his heart. How about going to the military school? I think you have a good chance of becoming an excellent officer. Prince Metternich looked at the boy with a smile. I think, in the Austrian Imperial Army, you must have the opportunity to serve in various places. Then you can naturally become a good traveler and scholar, if you want. So that's it. Egrin suddenly realized. It finally came. This is the trajectory of the Roman kings in history. The Austrian royal family very much hoped to assimilate the rare Roman king into its own, so in addition to the education given to the royal children, it also brought him into the imperial army. In 1822, Emperor Franz awarded him the rank of corporal at the age of 11, making him officially a member of the Habsburg Imperial Army. He was then sent to a military school to learn the skills an officer should have. Finally in 1831 he took command of the Hungarian 60th Infantry Regiment. However, this was not a starting point for the smug Roman king, but an end point. He damaged his body during harsh military training and unfortunately contracted tuberculosis in the military camp. On December 27, 1831, during a military parade in winter, he was found to have a very bad cough and had to return to Schönbrunn, where he became critically ill. According to doctors at the time, he coughed up blood so badly that he almost coughed up his own lung tissue. This is definitely not the fate that the current Egrin wants to replicate once. The sanitary conditions in this era were not very good. Living in military camps and military schools with dense crowds and worse sanitary conditions would naturally bring more severe dangers. If he followed the course of history, he would not have confidence that you will be able to escape. I'm very grateful for your kindness, but I don't have much interest in joining the army. After a moment of thought, Egrin rejected His Highness the Prince's memory. I like the pen more than the sword. But even so, a military experience is very useful to you, and I suggest you try it. Although His Royal Highness's tone was still very gentle, there was no smile on his face, obviously implying that this was not a suggestion but an order. But on the matter of life, Egrin did not intend to change his mind. Your words are also very reasonable. Then I will think about it carefully, and it will not be too late to make a decision in the future. So should I understand it as a rejection? Prince Metternich stared at Egrin. His gaze, with the unquestioning indulgence of people who have been in high positions for a long time, obviously he had no other answer for Egrin. However, this time the young man shook his head. I'm sorry, but I can only follow my heart now. The prince did not get angry, but laughed. A stubborn lad. He didn't know if it was a compliment or a sarcasm. If bowing to you can win your favor and improve my situation, then I am very willing to please you, but even if I do, you may not take it to heart, you have been in the diplomatic field all your life. After seeing too many sweet words, even if I say too much, I can't impress a veteran like you at all, so why should I do this? Egrin replied calmly. I think it might be better to be straightforward with you. A moment of silence. No one was angry, but there was no reconciliation. Looking at the clear eyes of the young man, the prince was thoughtful. Okay, I have already received your opinion, then you can go back first, and I will think about it. As he said, His Royal Highness waved his hand gently. I hope you have a pleasant afternoon. Goodbye, Your Highness. Egrin bowed slightly, then turned to leave. I don't want to see another person in you so soon, so please don't forget that this is Vienna and not Paris, that's my advice, Franz. Just as he was about to step out of the room, he heard a gentle word from behind. His footsteps stopped a little, but he stepped on immediately and left the room. After watching the young man leave, Prince Metternich walked to the window again, looking at the scenery outside the window and thinking to himself. After a while, he strode out of the room and walked towards His Majesty's office. When he came to the door, the attendant hurriedly paid his respects. I want to see Your Majesty, he said to the attendant in a matter-of-fact tone. Please wait a moment, His Royal Highness. The attendant opened the door and went in to report, then turned back immediately. Come in, Your Highness. Prince Metternich walked into the spacious hall, and his Emperor, His Majesty, was sitting behind a walnut desk, looking up at him. His Majesty Emperor Franz I, who was a few years older than the prince, had grey hair, but he showed no signs of exhaustion. He looked at the Prime Minister he appointed with piercing eyes, and his expression was serious and rigid, which matched the ancient royal family. He is not a particularly talented person. The only reason for him to sit on the throne is simply because he is the grandson of Queen Teresa. In the first 10 years of his reign, Austria repeatedly failed in the war with France. So much so that it became a backdrop for Napoleon's rise. Napoleon attacked the capital and signed an alliance under the city to cede land and pay indemnity. He was even forced to send his daughter to France for marriage to maintain his crumbling empire. Today, although Emperor Napoleon has turned into Lois, he still does not have confidence in his ability to maintain the power of the empire, so he relies on the army and secret police to maintain his rule. Even his own brothers occasionally will be monitored. But even so, he is not a cruel and ruthless monarch. He is happy to create a wise image and is quite generous to those around him. In the history books, he is just another ordinary witness on the downhill road of the ancient Habsburg dynasty, and he is not remembered by many people. However, at this moment, he is after all the master of a top power in the European continent. No one can ignore his weight. Sir, I heard that you just went to see our dear Franz. After taking a look at the Prime Minister, His Majesty the Emperor asked first, what happened? Some things have already happened, so we have to plan when some things have not happened. The Prime Minister replied. Hey! His Majesty the Emperor looked at the Prime Minister with some doubts, not understanding what he was talking about. After all, he is a diplomat. When Prince Metternich speaks, he always brings a little bit of cloud, mountain and fog unique to diplomats, but it doesn't matter, as the Emperor, he can naturally get a detailed explanation. Your Majesty, what do you think of our little Franz? The Prime Minister asked first. An excellent child, a very lovely young man. His Majesty the Emperor replied after a little thought, it's a pity that he has the wrong father. But the key is that he had a wrong father, so he was pinned on unrealistic delusions by many people. Prince Metternich replied calmly, Your Majesty, you must remember that just 3 years ago, France's several officers declared in the barracks that they wanted to support His Majesty Napoleon II to return to the throne, and with the increasingly unpopular rule of the Bourbon family, this kind of thing has been increasing day by day in the past few years. What is even more terrifying is that this kind of sentiment is not limited to in France. When his mother was in Parma, the Italians who passed by her balcony were also shouting "Long live Napoleon" too. Really? This is really ridiculous. Obviously Franz is just a child. Perhaps because of hearing a disgusting name, His Majesty the Emperor frowned slightly, but it was soon covered up by a wry smile. Do they think a child has what it takes to take them to heaven? Yes, of course it's very ridiculous, but the political opponents don't care about logic. The important thing is that they want to borrow that name against Bourbon and us. The Prime Minister looked seriously at His Majesty the Emperor. Also, let me remind you that a child cannot be a child forever. Franz will grow up. As he begins to grow, there will be renewed hope among the long-hidden supporters of the Bonaparte family, and there are really dangerous signs now, and I don't think he's going to grow up as a Habsburg or a German in the way we'd hoped. Aren't you a little too worried? His Majesty the Emperor smiled. You shouldn't spend so much energy on a child. He is worth the effort, you know better than me. He is a child with talent and willpower at the same time. Such a person will never be willing to die in obscurity, so when he grows up one day, will suddenly one day be occupied by fanatical ambitions, and then answer the call of those ambitious people? No one can guarantee this. The Prime Minister continued. His Majesty the Emperor was silent. I spoke to him just now, and honestly his demeanor and his tact and that kind of sophistication that doesn't match his age, if it were to show up on any of the other royals, I'd be happy for the future of our country. However, it is a pity that he is the special one. Prince Metternich's expression was a little strange, as if he had recalled something. I've been watching him, and when the news of Napoleon's death got here, he was crying on the surface, but I could see that he wasn't in any real shock or grief. It wasn't the loss of the most important person in his life at all. Look, he was 10 at the time. You know what that means? It means he has a talent that people like me and Talleyrand have when we are adults. He lacks that real affection, is a natural ruthless. This kind of performer is especially dangerous and scary if he is smart enough, and he can't just ignore it because he is just a child. This point, His Royal Highness, who has always been good at calculating, has missed the point. In history, when he learned that his father had lost his father, the young Roman king was devastated. How could he know that now this child is living in a body? What about souls that have nothing to do with Napoleon, or even with this age? Even if he wanted to really grieve, the child couldn't grieve, not because he really lacked human feelings. I admit, the risks you mentioned do exist. After quietly listening to the words of the Prime Minister, His Majesty the Emperor nodded lightly and finally agreed with the other party's opinion. So what do you think he should do? Your grandson is a lovely young man, but more importantly, he is a handy tool, a tool we use to terrorize France. But we should never use this tool. No one can afford it. It is worth the risk of releasing the Napoleonic plague on the European continent again. Prince Metternich's eyes were bright, and he seemed to recall something. We just need to hold him in our hands and let the Bourbon royal family have scruples about us. Now, the tool itself shouldn't have its own ideas. I admit that you are right, so what can you do about it? Asked His Majesty the Emperor. Let's send him to the army as soon as possible to educate him, use the military training to kill his hostility, cultivate his obedience, and make him an Austrian officer will also disappoint his potential French followers. Prince Metternich has long been prepared for this issue. After 2 years, we will find a suitable wife for him as soon as possible, and use the noose of the family to make it difficult for him to get rid of it. His Majesty the Emperor quietly listened to the Prime Minister's advice and did not feel anything wrong. Although Agron is only 15 years old, it is not uncommon for members of the royal family to marry early in this era. His Majesty the Emperor himself married 4 times because of several widowhood. The first marriage was in 1788. He was 20 at the time. His father, His Majesty Emperor Leopold II, was 18 when he first married in 1765. And the unfortunate King Louis XVI, who was beheaded, was only 15 years old when he married the Austrian princess in 1770, and the princess herself was even a year younger than him. So it's not shocking to start looking for a marriage partner at this age. Send into the army and get married. His Majesty the Emperor pondered again, it's really worth thinking about it. These are all insurance methods, and they may not all work, but at least they should be done. Seeing that his opinion has been adopted by His Majesty the Emperor, His Royal Highness is in a much better mood. After a pause, he lowered his voice again, as long as he has a wife and children, if he wants to get rid of his control in the future, at least we will have another choice. When he said this, there was a meaningful pause, and of course His Majesty the Emperor could understand what he meant. Oh, my poor grandson! His Majesty the Emperor sighed, there is always someone who wants him to live in peace. Equals 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 equals. After being approved by His Majesty the Emperor, His Excellency the Prime Minister continued to discuss some other important issues with His Majesty, and then left. Before returning to Vienna, he deliberately summoned Count von Dietrichstein, who was in charge of Egren's education. "Your Excellency, do you have any orders?" asked the Count. "Has your little master done anything unusual recently?" Prince Metternich asked bluntly. "From my point of view, everything is the same as usual, and there is nothing unusual," the Earl replied respectfully. "In addition, His Royal Highness has always been a bit tough. If you have any words to offend you just now, please forgive him. I think he didn't mean to offend you, and he usually treats people like that." "It sounds like you really think of yourself as the entourage of a French prince." The prince glanced at the other party with some displeasure. "We didn't put you by his side to ask you to plead for him. I have always been the entourage of the Austrian royal family, and I will never forget my responsibilities." The Count replied quickly. "I hope you don't forget this." The prince interrupted him impatiently. "I repeat, now that he is no longer a child, you can no longer treat him in a leisurely manner, no matter from now on. If he has any unruly thoughts and actions, you must report it to me in time." After a pause, he added, "When he makes a radical move, if it's too late to report it, you can temporarily detain him when necessary. Don't care about his special status, and then wait for me to deal with it. I am also responsible for everything." "Isn't he just being detained now?" The Count sighed softly. The prince looked at the Count coldly, with a "you should know what I mean" expression. "I see." The Count bowed. "Okay, I wish you all the best." His Royal Highness waved his hand and motioned for the Count to leave. While Prince Metternich and His Majesty the Emperor were discussing, Egren strolled down the long corridor, preparing to return to his bedroom. Because of the quarrel with Prince Metternich just now, he was in a bad mood, but he didn't show any signs on his face. For many years, he had been accustomed to keeping his thoughts in his heart. Just as he walked outside his room, he suddenly found that there seemed to be another person beside him. This is a woman of about 20 years old. She was wearing a long dress. Although she was not tall, she still looked tall because of her slender body. Her neck was also quite slender, making her movements and expressions quite elegant and agile. Her brown hair was curly in a fashionable style. He was looking at him with a smile that was not a smile. His blushing face was full of youthful charm, but because he was a first-time wife, he had the charm of a young woman. "Egren. Good morning." When Egren looked at her, she greeted him with a smile. "Good morning, Your Highness." Egren stopped and saluted her. "She is Princess Sophie. She was the daughter of King Maximilian I of Bavaria. She was born in 1805. In 1824, when she was 19 years old, she married Archduke Franz Karl, the youngest son of His Majesty the Emperor, that is, Agron's younger uncle. Since then, they have lived in Schönbrunn Palace, and the two of them have gotten to know each other since then. Agron had a pretty good relationship with her, and he liked the smile when she greeted him. This is not only because of her beautiful voice, but more importantly, she is the only person in this huge palace who can call herself by this nickname in French at the same time. In addition, although the prince concubine is his aunt, she is only 6 years older than him. Compared with other people in the court, this newly met princess has much more in common with him. It is worth mentioning that her sister, Princess Caroline, born in 1792, married the widowed Austrian emperor in 1816 as a sequel, so she became his nominal grandmother although only older than him. Just 19 years old. What's more worth mentioning is that their eldest sister, Princess Augusta, born in 1788, married Napoleon's adopted son Eugene de Beauharnais in 1806. Therefore, according to the strict order of seniority, the three sisters of the princess are counted as his brother and sister-in-law, grandmother and aunt respectively. The chaos of political marriage in the aristocratic world, and the efforts of the Napoleon family to assimilate desperately into the royal family of European countries when in power, is also evident. From the first day I saw her, Agron didn't bother about what should I call her. After all, in this luxurious and leisurely court, these royal family members who were born with fine clothes and jade food, why should they care about the so-called what about the turn order? From the moment they met, Princess Sophie was very friendly to him, and there was no Austrian prejudice at all. After all, Bavarians do not hate Napoleon. After all, in the era of Emperor Napoleon, the giant founded the Rhine League and promoted the Elector of Bavaria to the Kingdom of Bavaria, making it another power in Germany. In order to thank the Emperor Napoleon, the Bavarian king married his adopted son and followed Napoleon to fight until 1813, when Napoleon was at the end of his life. At the same time, although the empire was destroyed, the king took in his son-in-law Eugene, who had nowhere to go. Until Eugene's death in 1824, he had been enjoying a fairly good life. And Eugene and Princess Augusta are also very loving, which is a rare loving couple in political marriages. Princess Sophie, who grew up in such a living environment, naturally did not have any hostility towards the Bonaparte family. After marrying in Austria, it was normal for her to be friendly and kind to Agron. After the two got acquainted, Princess Sophie called him directly by you, which shows that she really looked at him differently. I heard that our dear Prime Minister has just found you. Princess Sophie asked as she approached. Your news is really well informed. Agron smiled helplessly. It doesn't look like you were having a good time chatting. Did he reprimand you? The princess asked again. It's not even a reprimand. It's just a bit embarrassing. Agron continued to smile bitterly. This lousy old man is probably trying to figure out something else. Princess Sophie said with some dissatisfaction. Agron did not continue. After all, this topic is not convenient to discuss in the corridor. Well, this is not a good place to talk. Princess Sophie squinted to the side, then raised her eyebrows, and her cleverness revealed another charm. Come with me. After she finished speaking, she turned around and left, her skirt fluttering while leaving a slender figure behind the boy, and Agron had to follow behind her. The two walked out of the grand palace, and then walked down the steps to the fountain at the door. Because of the sound of running water, they didn't have to worry about the partition wall having ears. Agron, what did he say? The princess asked again. He said he wanted me to go to a military school, and I didn't want to, Agron replied honestly. Then we had some arguments. Is that so? Princess Sophie lowered her eyes slightly and thought, he's not someone who can change his mind easily. This is where I am embarrassed. Agron nodded, I really don't want to go at all, but I don't want to blatantly go against his wishes. Then reject him forcefully. I think you should have this freedom. Princess Sophie curled her lips in displeasure. No matter how powerful he is, he can't dominate all the actions of the royal family, right? But he can persuade His Majesty to do so. Egrin shook his head. If His Majesty is persuaded by him, it may be difficult for me to refuse. Princess Sophie was dumbfounded. Indeed, His Majesty the Emperor is both the Supreme Emperor and the unquestionable Patriarch of the Habsburgs. His orders to the members of the royal family are absolutely not to be offended, not to mention that Egrin is still such a special and embarrassing identity. Even if he wants to refuse, I am afraid it's hard to do. If this is the case, then I will also go to Karl and let him intercede with you. His Majesty the Emperor is not a mean and ruthless person. As long as our husband and wife intercede together, there will always be a turnaround. Princess Sophie said. The voice became softer, apparently comforting Egrin. Egrin was silent. Her Royal Highness, the Prince and concubine, standing next to the fountain, although the distance between the two of them is very close, but because of the steam that spreads everywhere, her side seems to be covered with a halo, which looks hazy and real. "Thank you," he stammered after a moment. "I'm not saying I'm grateful for your help, but I'm very grateful for your kindness. It's really something I cherish." "Haha, cute child." Seeing his reaction, Princess Sophie couldn't help laughing. "Don't be so restrained, after all, we are a family now, aren't we? Of course I should do my best to help you." "You're not a few years older than me," Egrin retorted in a low voice. "But I'm already married, and I'm destined to take on this place. I've lost the qualification to stay young, and you haven't." Princess Sophie's expression became serious, and then she raised her hand and pointed to the grand palace opposite the individual. "Egrin, do you know why I am so kind to you?" "To be honest, I do have some doubts sometimes," Egrin replied. Her Royal Highness raised her head, looked at the sculpture at the top of the fountain, and sighed sadly. "Before I got married, my brother-in-law and your brother were dying. He told me when he was seriously ill that he was happy enough in his life, that he had never betrayed anyone. Even if he went to heaven, he was worthy of heart, he can face that person in an upright manner. But he still has one regret that has never been resolved, and that is his younger brother. He is already destined to be unable to save the poor child who was trapped in the cage. The pain can't stop, so he begged me to do my best to take care of you after I got here, so that you don't die early because of despair." After saying this, Princess Sophie withdrew her gaze, and then looked at the young man in front of her seriously. "I don't want him to die with regret, so I will keep this promise. Egrin, you can treat me as your sister here, and it will help you grow up safely and happily." Egrin listened quietly to her words, and suddenly felt a little pain in his heart. Obviously this is not actually his own business, but he somehow feels a sense of sadness. Not only for the late Eugene de Beauharnais step-brother, but also for the Princess Sophie in front of her. The two world lines that had already diverged seemed to have an intersection in her. Historically, the relationship between the two was very close. After she was married to the Austrian court, the Roman king, who lacked friendship all his life, regarded her as one of the few close friends in Schönbrunn Palace, and Princess Sophie also seemed to have an extraordinary view of the Roman king. Emotion. The two often danced together at balls, and they interacted a lot at ordinary times. Because of their mutual affection, they caused a lot of rumors in the court. Some people even suspected that Maximilian, the youngest son of Her Royal Highness, was the King of Rome's illegitimate child. Such rumors are of course unfounded, but when the Roman king died prematurely in 1832, it was a common fact that the princess was distraught. Perhaps in the eyes of Princess Sophie at the time, the King of Rome was her real relative in the strange Austrian court. "I will also do my best to protect you, Your Highness." In the midst of his emotion, he assured the other party in a low voice. Suddenly, there was a little more sentimentality between the two. "Egrin, don't be discouraged, these bad days will eventually pass." After a while, Princess Sophie adjusted her emotions and comforted the boy. "I said I will have the final say here one day, and then is the day when you are completely free, no one can bully you anymore, you can do whatever you want. Just wait until then, trust me. Agrin knew that Her Royal Highness was right. Although she married the Emperor's youngest son, Archduke Karl, it is well known that the Emperor's eldest son Ferdinand suffered from a serious congenital disease and lost his fertility. To the side of Her Royal Highness. Historically, Ferdinand ascended the throne in 1835, and abdicated in 1848 because of a serious illness and was unable to handle state affairs. The son of Princess Sophie, Franz Joseph, succeeded at the age of 18. Since then, the Queen Mother Sophie has been named. His own willpower dominates the Austrian court, and he has truly become a man of his own. However, it was already 1848, and now it is 1826. Even if Her Royal Highness Princess Sophie does not change her mind in the future and is really willing to fulfill her promise, it will take at least 20 years for her to have the final say in the court. How many 20 years of life can be wasted here? He didn't want to wait that long. He also didn't have that much time to endure. I believe in you, Your Highness. Agrin closed his eyes with great emotion. I will wait for that day. I believe in you. Egrin closed his eyes very moved. I will wait for that day. Seeing Egrin's sincerity and joy, Sophie blinked and felt very relieved. For a while, she didn't know what to say, just looked at Agrin quietly. Agrin, as long as there is hope, no matter how many difficulties you encounter, you can overcome the past. Besides, your current situation is not particularly bad, so there is no reason to be discouraged. After a pause, she stretched out her hand and patted it. He patted Egrin's cheek. Okay, go back to rest first, you're already tired today. Her intimacy made people feel more intimate, and even Agrin couldn't help but be moved. It's a pity that he was moved, and he was destined to not listen to the other party's words, because he couldn't wait. This gorgeous cage must not be its own home. After saying goodbye to Princess Sophie, Agrin returned to his residence in the palace along the same path. Even as a prisoner, his living treatment is not much indebted, and it is not much different from other members of the royal family. The room is thickly carpeted, with gilt sconces hanging on the walls, and a purple and gold patterned wall covering. On the inside there is a fireplace with large decorative paintings on the walls on either side, and a velvet upholstered bench beside it, next to a large china vase from Saxony with flowers in it as a decorate. In general, the layout of the entire room is full of the elegance of the palace, but it lacks real warmth. This is where he grew up in his new life, but no matter how comfortable it is, this place is nothing but a high-level cage for him. It was already early summer, and the room temperature was relatively high, so he opened the window, sat on the bench, picked up a book and flipped through it. But not long after, the door was suddenly knocked. His Royal Highness, may I come in? The voice of his guardian Count von Dietrichstein came from outside the room. Please come in. Egrin casually put the book on the cushion next to him. The door opened quickly, and the Count walked in slowly, then sat opposite Egrin. His Royal Highness, the prince found me just now. As soon as he sat down, he went straight to the point. He is a little dissatisfied with your tough attitude towards him. This is not my intention. Egrin was a little displeased. I just rejected his arrangement. I think I have this right. Do I have it? His Royal Highness's arrangement has been carefully thought out. It may not be so attractive, but it must be quite suitable for your current situation. The Count avoided Egrin's rhetorical question and seemed to try to persuade Egrin, so I think you better to reconsider. That is to say, no matter how I answer, in the end I have to obey everything he has arranged for me, right? Egrin sneered, if that's the case, why bother asking me for my opinion? Just me to wherever His Royal Highness wants me to go. His mockery made the Count's expression quite complicated, both helpless and sad. After a moment of silence, the Count spoke again. His Royal Highness, I have been by your side for 7 years. The Count looked at the young man under his supervision and said solemnly, a person's life is no more than 70 years, and I have put 1/10 of my life in yours. Sighed, I've been taking care of you with all my heart for the past 7 years, please believe that I didn't do this to make it all a joke, although it was an obligation at first. I want you more than anyone else. I can enjoy a generally happy life. So, Your Royal Highness, I implore you to put aside your emotions and think carefully about what I am going to say next. After speaking sincerely, he turned to the topic again. Yes, people of your age hate being dominated and ordered from a high place, but from a practical point of view, it is objective for you to enter the army. It's good for you too, isn't it? Although your father has passed away, his reputation still lives on in the world, especially those soldiers. Even the British soldiers admire him, so if you go his way, wouldn't it be the best to meet people's expectations? If you showed your talent and built your reputation in the military, your situation could be very different. After speaking, the Count looked at Egrin again, his eyes full of sincerity. He is suggesting that his students may be able to get rid of the chains by relying on their prestige in the army in the future. From his own standpoint, he can only hint at this step. In all fairness, his words are also very reasonable, and they are very convincing, but the young man who knows the subsequent fate of the Roman king has no expectations at all. In the original history, he entered the army according to the will of the Austrian royal family and received rigorous military training, but what he finally got was nothing more than an honorary title, and he had no power to command any troops at all. What's more, Matin is also determined not to give him any chance to show his military capabilities. Just in 1830, with the outbreak of the July Revolution in France, the revolutionary wave swept across Europe again. Poland and Italy became the center of the storm, and the smug Roman king insisted that he lead his troops to protect the mother's Parma, but Metternich. He categorically denied his suggestion, made the Roman king grief-stricken, and died 2 years later of depression due to tuberculosis contracted in the military camp. It is conceivable that if he joins the Austrian army with the idea of walking on the glorious old road of his father, then only despair is waiting for him. So he definitely didn't plan to take this road. However, given his current situation, even if he wants to resist, he cannot rely entirely on the hard cap, and he must pay attention to his strategy. It's a pity that the chips in his hand are pitiful now, and even if he wants to use strategies, it is not so easy. Since you talk to me about your feelings, sir, I admit that I do believe that you have feelings for me, so let's be honest. Answer me, you really believe that Your Excellency the Prime Minister would be happy to see me with prestige anywhere? Agrin sighed, frankly, I don't believe it at all. The Count was at a loss for words. He wanted to say something comforting, but under the eyes of the young man, he couldn't say anything. His Royal Highness is already in his 50s, and you are only in your teens. Finally, he could only continue to hint in a low voice. Time is on your side. As long as you continue to follow the steps, one day, the imprisonment on you will be loosened. You make it seem like he is the only one in Austria who wants to deal with me. Iger shook his head solemnly, expressing his complete disbelief. Although I have a title, who would really consider me an Austrian? Yes, I am Duke Reichstadt, but the is in Bohemia. I may not be able to visit once in my life. Obviously, I am just a beggar with an empty title, living in this palace. I don't have any crowns in Europe anymore. It's not what His Royal Highness thinks, and everyone else thinks the same, right? If so, what's the point of doing my best? Under Agrin's cross-examination, the Count's face became even more embarrassed, and he knew in his heart that what the other party said was true. But if you keep resisting His Royal Highness's arrangement, I'm afraid he will be very angry. In the end, he could only be powerless to say the terrible consequences of continuing to fight. Then what will he do when he gets angry? Send me to some desert island? On what crime? Does not respect Metternich's crime. Agrin was not frightened, but sneered again. A string of rhetorical questions, I don't remember anyone saying I was a criminal, did I? Of course he won't do this. The Count waved his hand quickly, but he will definitely punish you in various ways, and even we will definitely be punished. That is to say, because I have utility value, even if I offend him, he will not do anything to me, but he will let you bear his anger, right? Egrin continued to sneer, he used you to come threaten me. Perhaps I have overestimated our place in your heart, but, Your Highness, you can believe that Metternich has many ways to make your situation much more difficult than it is now. The Count replied, as far as I am concerned. Following you will not bring me much glorious resume. Even if I drive me away, I can enjoy the rest of my life, but what about you? What will you do then? If I am here, at least I can share some of the pressure for you. Egrin was speechless for a moment. It's not that he was speechless, but that the other party's words came from the sincerity, and he really couldn't bear to say anything sharp to hurt the other party's heart. Although it was a person sent by the Austrian Emperor, but after all, he has taken care of himself for so many years, if he has no feelings, it is definitely not. Well, since you have said so, I will seriously consider it. If it is not possible, I will agree to him. After thinking for a while, Egrin finally nodded and agreed, however, I will never let May so easily. Teen succeeded, no matter what, I have to persevere, even if it is just to make him unhappy, I have to persevere, you have to help me again, I will nod my head until the last moment, let him know that I am definitely not his submissive slave. Do you have to be willful once? The Count looked at him embarrassedly. Egrin nodded again. The Count blinked, the threat of the prince and the feelings he had spent with Egrin over the years made him extremely entangled in his heart, and he was unable to make a decision. Can you guarantee that you will obey the arrangement until the end? Finally, he asked carefully. I can't afford to lose your care, so I will, sir. Egrin replied with a sincere look. Of course he didn't want to, but he didn't mind verbally reassuring him. In the environment he is in now, how to lie with the most sincere attitude has always been a must-have knowledge for the dignitaries of the court. Although he is young, he is at least a little warm. Okay. If that's the case, I'll do my best to intercede for you. The Count sighed and made his final decision. Maybe if you insist a little longer, His Royal Highness may finally change his mind. Egrin knew that this was the greatest kindness that the Count could do. He was in the middle of the gap, and his situation was not much more comfortable than himself. Thank you, sir. I won't put you in trouble again, he reassured. Just after the conversation between the two ended, an attendant knocked on the door and walked in. With a perfect smile, he respectfully saluted the little Duke. Your Highness, His Majesty the Emperor invites you to dinner. Your Highness, His Majesty the Emperor invites you to dinner. After speaking, the attendant respectfully left the room, leaving behind the two people who looked at each other. Although he is the grandson of His Majesty the Emperor, Egrin does not have the opportunity to have dinner with His Majesty the Emperor every day. The order came suddenly at this time, which does not seem to be a good sign. It seems that His Royal Highness has persuaded His Majesty, and his determination is greater than he imagined. After a while, Count Dietrich Stein whispered. Yes, so it's too late for you to regret it now, I can understand. Egrin nodded. Since I promised you, since I will not go back on it, but Your Highness, there is only so much I can do for you, I hope you can understand. The Count sighed deeply. Then, he stood up again, okay, I won't bother you anymore, you can take a good rest first, and then see Your Majesty later. After the Count left, Egrin picked up the book again and looked out the window. The room was silent again, except for the ticking of the chimes and the increasingly slanting sunlight outside the window, reminding people of the passage of time. When the night began to fall on the earth, Egrin finally walked out of his room and followed the servant to the dining room. Although it is now night, the splendid lights brought by the chandeliers on the ceiling illuminate the dining room translucently, and a group of uniformed attendants shuttle through it, showing the extraordinary style of the royal family. When Egrin entered the dining room, His Majesty the Emperor had already arrived and sat on the main seat. So he walked up to His Majesty the Emperor and saluted him respectfully. Although he ruled over a vast empire, the passage of time inevitably left traces on Emperor Franz's eye. His Majesty's hair was already grey, and no amount of majesty could hide that old and decadent atmosphere. But even so, he still has enough energy to effectively rule the empire. Because today was not a formal occasion, he didn't wear fancy clothes, he just wore a military uniform as casual clothes, and he didn't wear medals. The simple and plain attire made him look a little more energetic than when he was dressed up. His Majesty the Emperor seemed to be in a good mood today, looked up and down at Egrin, and then nodded happily. "Franz, every time I see you, I wonder if you can be more handsome, but I am not disappointed every time." The sudden compliment left Egrin at a loss. He didn't quite understand the meaning of His Majesty the Emperor, but he must first express his gratitude. "Thank you for your compliment, and I will try my best not to disappoint you in the future. Please sit down, it's really pleasant to have a young man by your side during dinner." His Majesty the Emperor smiled. Egrin obeyed His Majesty's will and found a seat and sat down. This is a long dining table. His Majesty the Emperor is sitting on the main seat, while the Queen is sitting opposite him. Egrin is beside His Majesty the Emperor, and opposite him are the second Prince Karl and Princess Sophie and his wife. Because of his poor health, the Crown Prince Ferdinand often has epileptic seizures, so he has not been married yet, nor has he participated in His Majesty's dinner, eating alone in his bedroom. After he was seated, Princess Sophie looked at him, then smiled and blinked. "Good evening, Franz." "Good evening, Your Highness." Egrin also greeted her. The two smiled at each other, then looked away. As His Majesty the Emperor began to dine, dinner officially began. Because tonight is not a grand palace banquet, but a dinner between members of the royal family, the meal is not luxurious. The cold cuts are white sausages, complemented by a cream of mushroom soup, and the main course is diced sirloin, served with a sauce made from cod and caper buds, and there are a number of small desserts on the side. During the meal, the members of the royal family are closest to each other in the day, and it is usually the time when they need the least to stand on the shelf, so they talk a lot with each other, and even His Majesty the Emperor, who is always serious and difficult to approach, seems approachable. "Up, Franz." After taking a few bites, His Majesty the Emperor looked at the boy. "I heard that you rejected Metternich's proposal? Can you tell me your reason?" "I don't know how His Royal Highness relayed my words to you, but I have already told His Royal Highness the specific reasons. It's very simple, I don't want to be a soldier, Your Majesty." Egrin replied as calmly as possible, "This is purely for interest. The problem is, it's not that I mean against him. But in life, not everything will be satisfactory, even as an emperor." His Majesty the Emperor spread his hands. "No, I should say, even more so as an emperor." His Majesty's tone was very kind, just like an ordinary grandfather educating his grandson. But in this kindness, there is an unquestionable authority, at least in this court, no one can defy its will. Egrin took a deep breath and calmed down his suddenly accelerated heartbeat. "Your Majesty, this is not just my occasional willfulness. I made this decision after careful deliberation. Although it is indeed absurd to think carefully at my age, I ask you to listen to my reasons." "Oh." His Majesty the Emperor was very amused, so he nodded, "Let's talk. My father was a man who brought countless nightmares to the European continent. Because of his temporary greed, from Lisbon to Moscow, countless young people died in foreign places, never seeing their family members who missed them. I can feel it to this day." Egrin continued in a deep, guilt-filled tone, "Because I know the nightmare he caused, so I feel like I can't stare at the guns that create grievances. I don't want to talk to him. In the same way, I exchanged my blood for my reputation, and those shiny uniforms could not impress me. I just want to live here as an ordinary person, live in peace, and pray for those warriors who died in vain." Because he had rehearsed it many times in his heart, his words were so sincere that he almost believed them. However, he definitely didn't think so. He had had enough of this secluded life, and only wanted to regain his freedom. In order to achieve this goal, he didn't mind burning the whole world at all. Under his infection, the people around the table were quiet. His Majesty the Emperor listened to Egren's confession in amazement, and for a while he was a little persuaded. Metternich's words and grandson's words were lingering in his mind, and he felt that it made sense after weighing it. "Look, we have taught Franz to be a monk. This kindness is really touching." After a while, he smiled awkwardly and eased the atmosphere at the table. "Franz, I don't want to interfere with your wishes, but as your grandfather, I have an obligation to plan for your future." "His Majesty." At this moment, Princess Sophie suddenly spoke. His Majesty the Emperor looked at his daughter-in-law in surprise. "Sophie, what's wrong? I think what Franz said makes sense." Sophie raised her head bravely and looked at His Majesty the Emperor. "Franz doesn't have to live like Napoleon, I don't think he's fit to be an officer either. You just didn't. Are you saying he is handsome? How can such a child withstand the harsh brutality of the army? Since he prefers the pen to the sword, as elders, we should satisfy his wishes, right? He likes a quiet life. Just let him go on like this, maybe one day he can become a poetic Napoleon and leave more immortal poems for your Schönbrunn palace. Wouldn't that be nice too?" Egren did not expect that Princess Sophie just said she wanted to help him, but she actually did what she said, and it was so fast. Saying some nice comforting words in private is completely different from the pressure that needs to be faced to argue with His Majesty the Emperor in person. From this point of view, she really takes good care of herself. "Sophie, you Bavarians have always loved poetry and music more than guns." Her husband, Duke Karl, laughed and made a joke, trying to smooth things out for everyone. Princess Sophie did not appreciate it, however. Her eyes rolled slightly, giving her husband a stern glance. Under this stern gaze, Archduke Karl took a sip of soup and gagged his mouth. The second prince, Archduke Karl, has always been mild-mannered, even a little weak, so he is respectful and afraid of his strong wife Sophie. In 1848 in history, he had the opportunity to inherit the Austrian throne, but because of Sophie's insistence, he gave up throne, ceding the throne to their son, later Emperor Franz Joseph. In the situation that the male members of the Habsburgs are declining day by day, Princess Sophie firmly controls the court with her hard will, and even claims to be the only man in the Habsburg court. It was only at this time that Egren saw this momentum. "Your Majesty, Sophie is also right. We should not only train Franz, but also refer to his personal opinions. Otherwise, it will only make him depressed and miserable at a young age, which is very important to everyone. Not good." Seeing that her sister, who is also the nominal daughter-in-law, was so active in defending Egren, Her Majesty Queen Caroline couldn't help but speak. The Queen, who is only 34 years old this year, is the fourth wife of His Majesty the Emperor. She is 24 years older than His Majesty the Emperor. When Her Majesty the Emperor is getting older, she is more like a father and daughter than a husband and wife. When two people get along, it is more like a father-daughter model. His Majesty the Emperor treats his new wife with a gentle and tolerant attitude, but they do not communicate much with each other. Instead, she can talk more with her sister, Princess Sophie. His Majesty the Emperor did not expect that the trivial matter he originally wanted to settle at the dinner table suddenly turned into an argument among members of the royal family, and his wife and daughter-in-law unanimously supported the grandson's opinion. Maybe it would be a better choice to let Napoleon's son say goodbye to guns forever? Metternich's suggestion was still lingering in his mind, and he was suddenly uncertain. Just as he was thinking about it, the dinner was coming to an end, and the attendants brought the fruit after the meal, and His Majesty the Emperor decided to observe it for the time being. In this way, as His Majesty the Emperor got up and left the table, the people at the dinner left the restaurant with a happy or depressed mood. Agron is the lucky party. In any case, with the help of Princess Sophie, he finally escaped the trouble temporarily. However, this is only temporary. If you don't get rid of this kind of snoring life as soon as possible, then you will still be manipulated by others at will, and you can't escape today but not tomorrow. Agron he suddenly heard the greeting in his ear, and turned his face to see Princess Sophie next to him. She changed her name after she left the restaurant. In any case, her gentle smile always makes people feel at ease. Agron, are you free tomorrow? If you are free, let's go hunting outside to relax. Obviously, she wanted to relieve herself a little psychological pressure. And just a moment ago, she was still trying her best to protect herself in front of the Emperor. Under the infection of her smile, Agron straightened his back unknowingly. As long as it's your call, of course I'm free. Of course Agron would not want to miss Princess Sophie's warm invitation. He got up early the next morning, moved his body a bit, and followed the princess attendant to the fountain. Good morning, Agron. Princess Sophie, who was ready to go, greeted him with a smile on her face. Are you ready? Unlike her usual appearance in a long dress, she was wearing a hunting suit today. Tight-fitting clothes and breeches accentuated her figure more exquisitely, and her long grey hair was tucked behind her head, making her look full of vigor. I'm ready, Agron replied. Okay, then while it's not too hot yet, let's go. Her Royal Highness the Princess waved her hand excitedly. Today is a beautiful day, and it is a sunny day. The weather is very suitable for long trips, but after all, it is already early summer, and the temperature will rise at noon, which is not suitable for vigorous exercise, so if you want to hunt, it is best to morning. So the two of them stopped talking and walked into the garden together, where the attendants brought the horses, and then they rode their horses through the zoo and botanical garden of Schönbrunn Palace, and ran westward to the outskirts of Vienna. In the vast forest, the two of them rode side by side, and Her Royal Highness's entourage followed behind. Under the shade of heavy trees, the bright sunlight gradually became dim. Breathing the fresh and shady air, Agron only felt relaxed and happy. Agron. In the silence, Princess Sophie whispered. What you said in front of us last night, is it the truth? Agron's heart suddenly tightened. He didn't know whether Sophie was speaking on behalf of herself or someone else. I've been looking you in the eyes while you're talking. Before he could answer, Sophie continued, to be honest, your words are eloquent and full of emotion, and it stands to reason that I should believe it, but, when I see your eyes, I feel your heart is burning. Agron, you don't mean it, do you? We've known each other for a while, although you always deliberately put your mood hide it, but I don't know why, I just feel that you are not sincere. Those words are all deceptive scenes. Agron, did I blame you? Agron remained silent and did not answer. Don't worry, these words are just what we said in private. I will never mention it to the second person again, even to Karl. Sophie turned her head and looked at the boy with a smile on her face. I just want to make sure I'm not blaming you, and I didn't mean to interrogate you. If you don't like it, you can leave it unanswered. Now that he's already said this, it doesn't make much sense for him to continue to explain. It will only cast a shadow on the trust between the two people for no reason. As for silence, it doesn't make sense. Instead, it seems that he is afraid. Yes, I was lying. So he simply admitted. I have no intention of becoming a writer or traveler at all, these are just words to fool them. Well, it seems that you are quite frank with me, and my kindness is not in vain. Princess Sophie smiled, and then asked again. If that's the case, why would you reject His Royal Highness's arrangement again? Although it must be ill-intentioned, it does help you objectively. I know that if I obey the fate of the future. Of course it is impossible to answer. Egrin lowered his head and looked at the trembling mane on his mount's head. I don't actually object to joining the army after a while, but I'm reluctant to be by your side now. If I go now, later there will definitely be a lot less chance to see you, so I'd rather wait a little longer. Have you learned the coaxing words of a prostitute at a young age? Princess Sophie glared at him, then raised her hand to pick up the whip, and she was about to give him a whip. Egrin didn't dodge, just looked at Sophie calmly. Sophie's whip didn't really go down. She put her hand down again, and looked forward. You are too short of friends, so you may value our friendship too much. There are not many people who are willing to be my friends. Egrin replied in a low voice. I don't know whose friendship to cherish except you, because I don't have it. After getting this answer, Sophie was obviously a little sad. This is really God's trick. Why does it have to make you suffer like this? Finally, she sighed. Egrin, don't be discouraged, everything will be fine. As long as I'm here, no one here can bully you. Look, you don't care about giving kindness to people like me, but you don't let me cherish such precious time. Isn't it hard for a strong man? Egrin looked at each other with aggrieved eyes. If you want me to change the idea, then it's better not to treat me like a sister, just like everyone else. Haha. Sophie couldn't help laughing. I didn't realize you were so articulate. Well, let's stop talking about these unpleasant things, just concentrate on hunting. After speaking, she picked up the shotgun and aimed it at the flying quail in the woods. Boom! With a loud bang, the smoke filled between the two, but unfortunately the princess's marksmanship was not very good and missed. The sound of gunfire woke the woods up, and all kinds of birds in the woods jumped up one after another. Egrin also raised his shotgun and aimed at the birds flying around in the distance. Because of the lush trees in the forest and the dim light, the field of vision for shooting was not good, so he could only do his best. Hit! Sophie let out a cheer, as if she had hit the target. As she said that, she steered her horse to the direction where the prey fell, and Egrin naturally followed behind her, and at the same time replaced the shotgun with bullets. Egrin, your marksmanship is good. Looking at the dead quail under the horse's hoof, Sophie looked at the boy with approval. It's just good luck occasionally. Egrin pretended to be modest. Look how proud you are. Sophie was unconvinced again, picked up the shotgun and replaced it with bullets. Look at me. She raised the shotgun on horseback, aimed it at the prey, slowed her breath, and pulled the trigger, all in one go. Boom! With a loud bang, this time an unfortunate turtle-dove fell to the ground. Hit! Sophie cheered for herself this time, and then ran over on her horse, ready to appreciate her victory, and Egrin also raised his shotgun and fired a shot in front, but because of the shade of trees, he did not know prey was shot down. I beat you this time! Sophie cheered. In this way, the two of them rode their horses through the woods, shooting from time to time, and they competed to see who had the most prey. Time passed in this relaxed and warm atmosphere. Egrin, it seems that you are better than me. After a while, Sophie calculated the record of the two and said regretfully. It's just my luck, Egrin replied humbly. While chatting, the two walked down a slope. Because this horse was not his daily mount, he did not ride very steadily on the downhill, and the people on the horse swayed more severely, so he carefully controlled the horse and chatted with Sophie at the same time. Egrin, promise me one thing. Sophie said suddenly. Please tell me. Egrin replied immediately. No matter how much you achieve later, you have to be rational and don't spread your hatred on everyone. Although the Austrians are guarding you, they also have their troubles, and most of them have nothing to do with you. Disgusting. No one can tell what will happen in the future, but of course I won't let hatred blind my eyes. Egrin replied briefly, if you ask me to do this, then I promise you, I will. Sophie kept looking him in the eyes while he answered, and when he finished, she nodded happily. Great, I believe in you. Agron, this is what I want to see in you the most. She did not expect that, just when she was overjoyed, a sudden accident and disaster would come here. The hoof of her mount slammed heavily on the wooden stake hidden in the grass, and the crippled horse let out a groan, then the upper body slumped down, and the lower body suddenly lifted. Yet, Sophie, who was swayed upwards, screamed. OMG! Egron felt his blood freeze. Neither him nor the original soul in his body could imagine what would happen next. He immediately stretched out his hand, grabbed Sophie's body heavily, and tugged hard. It was a knee-jerk reaction, and at this moment he was making a decision for himself. Fortunately, he caught Sophie and pulled her off her mount, avoiding the catastrophe of being thrown off by the horse, but while he was holding Sophie, his violent movements also made his mount out of his control. He fell off the right side of the horse in one fell swoop, his right shoulder touched the ground first, his forehead touching the ground, and he lay there on his side. Sophie was in his arms and fell to the ground with him. Agron! Sophie, who was already stunned, suddenly let out a scream, and then disregarded her manners, knelt on the soft soil and held his head. Are you okay? Seeing that the boy had scratches on his forehead and face, a small amount of blood, and the corners of his mouth twitched slightly, her tears flooded her eyes and then overflowed. Agron, are you all right? She cried with tears. I'm fine, Your Highness. Agron looked at Sophie and couldn't help showing a smile, but the blood dripping from the corner of his mouth made the answer unconvincing at all. Sorry. Sophie apologized while crying, and then raised her head, looking back with shame and anger that could almost set the entire forest on fire. Come on people! When the news of Duke Reichstadt accidentally fell off his horse while hunting reached the Prime Minister's residence in Vienna, it was already noon. Prince Metternich, who had just finished lunch, heard the news in amazement, interrupted his nap, and instructed the people around him to call the police chief and his assistants. After giving the order, he sat back at his desk and looked at the bright clear sky outside the window. God always surprises us. After a long while, he let out a sigh that he didn't know whether it was regret or joy. Soon the police chief and his assistant, Mr. Friedrich von Jens, arrived at his office. Friedrich von Jens is a middle-aged man with deep eyes and a melancholy expression on his face. He was Metternich's confidant and a diplomat and writer who is now well known in Europe. He was born in Prussia, and his ancestors were Huguenots who were expelled from France. In his early years, he was a liberal and staunchly opposed to the Bourbons' autocratic monarchy in France and Spain, but when the revolution was launched, he, like the British philosopher Burke, rose firmly against France and the revolution. In his view, the most beautiful order in the world is not the new one, but the old one, an old feudal system in which each class takes its place, each running the society in its own right. Therefore, he believes that the rebellion of the third class, which destroyed all order in France, must ultimately be responsible for the bloodshed in Europe. In less than 6 weeks, they have violated these 3 basic conditions. The representatives of the Third Estate have not received the slightest authority, they have shamefully trampled on the rights of the other estates, declaring themselves to constitute the National Assembly alone. This is what he said in his own words. Mentioned in the writings. After the baptism of the whole era of the Great Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, the liberal ideals he once had in his youth are long dead. He and Metternich agree that this is an era when the essence of tradition is declining, and the politicians' the only function is to try to maintain the existence of the beautiful tradition and the old system before it completely dies, and leave the rest to future generations to solve by themselves. Just because he knew that his career would inevitably become an empty talk, he was often dominated by despair, and his life was only the body, and the rest was only the cynicism of chasing fame and beauty. Even so, he was still an excellent diplomat. Since 1812, Jens has maintained close contact with all major events on the European continent. He is Metternich's closest assistant, close friend, and advisor. The two cooperated very happy until he died. After both came to the office, the Prime Minister cut to the chase. Just now I received news that Duke Lachstedt was injured when he fell off a horse while hunting on the outskirts of Schönbrunn Palace. His life and death are unknown. Both of them were a little surprised, but they both regained their composure very quickly. You have to block the news. Although this matter will soon spread throughout the country and even all of Europe, at least the initiative should be on us, and it is up to me to decide how to release the news. The prince ordered the police chief. In addition, if the Duke of Histedt does have an accident, there will be a commotion, so you have to be prepared. In particular, be careful not to allow anyone to spread rumors and focus hatred on Austria. Yes. The police chief accepted the order. After giving the order, Prince Metternich resumed his usual calm. If he really died like this, it might be a relief for everyone, including himself. After a moment of silence, Prince Metternich said glumly, "For someone like him, continue the current situation may not necessarily make life very happy." Then what do you mean? The police chief seemed to understand what he meant. We just don't care, let's watch him see God sooner rather than later. Stupid. Metternich glared at his subordinates. We can't afford the notoriety of murdering him, we must do our best. Send him the best doctor. Let God decide the rest. If God decides to go sooner to relieve suffering for all, then we will do his will. Yes, I understand. The police chief bowed his head and obeyed. In the worst case scenario, the King of France will be so happy that he jumps out of bed, and the name that haunts him will soon disappear completely. The elder brother is dead ahead, and even his nephew Louis XVII and Napoleon and his son can't survive him. There are other heirs of the Bonaparte family, replied M. Gents in a low voice. But there is only one heir to Napoleon. If he dies, it means that Napoleon is extinct. No one in the Bonaparte family can have his appeal. Prince Metternich shook his head. Although they all knew that Napoleon had illegitimate sons, in the spectrum of orthodoxy, they did not exist. The Duke of Enghien is also the only son of Prince Condat, but Napoleon shot him without hesitation. Maybe this is retribution. Gents shrugged and sneered. There was another silence in the room, and they recalled the past events that were dusty in history. In 1804, in retaliation for the attempted assassination of the Royalists, Napoleon sent the gendarmerie to capture the Duke of Enghien in exile in Baden back to France and then directly execute him. Although the current Prince Condat is still alive, he has no other heirs or brothers. So the Condé family, which once had a glorious history, is doomed to extinction. The Bourbon family is not qualified to be happy too early. Even if the Bonaparte family temporarily withdraws, they still have a vicious enemy lying in the heart of France. Your Royal Highness, the envoy of the Duke of Orleans came to Vienna yesterday, and I was just about to report to you. Mr. Gents shrugged, don't forget, the Orleans family has no shortage of heirs. Oh, the French. His Royal Highness sneered full of sarcasm. Equals 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 Duke Reichstedt's fall from a horse is like a pebble thrown into a lake, causing an uproar in Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. There are whispers about this incident everywhere, some people are sad and some people are secretly happy. Only in the center of the storm, everything was calm. Agron was lying in his room at this moment, indulging in the deep darkness. He was hurriedly carried back, and before he lost consciousness, he only remembered Sophie hugging him tightly, tears falling on his cheeks and arms like raindrops. Seeing her so heartbroken, Agron only felt the pain in his body lighten a little, then he felt as if his body was floating on the water, and then he fainted. Even in the 21st century, there are still many famous people who have fallen from horses and died or were seriously injured, but he did not expect that when he came to this world, he would suffer such bad luck. Maybe this child was doomed from birth. But, this is definitely not the result he wants to accept. No. Definitely can't fall here. I'm not free yet. I still have too much to do. I can't outlive the original owner of this body, I can't be the laughing stock of myself and others. After I don't know how long, with anger and unwillingness, the boy finally tenaciously regained his consciousness. There was silence all around, as if nothing could be heard. Your Majesty! Your Majesty! Your Majesty, please wake up! The soft call slowly gathered in his ears. What, Your Majesty, is Emperor Franz here now? No, no, as if speaking to me. What am I, Your Majesty? My empire is long gone. The current of consciousness stimulated his brain, and he slowly opened his eyes. Your Majesty! Your Majesty! The voice became louder and louder, and the tone became more rapid, full of excitement and happiness. Am I dreaming? The blurry vision slowly focused, and then he realized that he was not dreaming. A girl in a black maid costume and a white apron crouched beside her. She looks a little older than herself, with a petite stature, and her facial features are quite delicate. The golden hair on her head pours down from the white turban, and her blue eyes are full of tears, looking at herself all the time. Pretty is pretty, but, what the is going on here? Agron looked around and found himself lying on the bed in his room, with no one around. Judging from the darkness outside the window, it should be early morning now. Who are you? He asked in a low voice, ignoring the pain in his body. Your Majesty! God bless you, you finally woke up. Seeing Egron regaining consciousness, the maid's cry became stronger and stronger, thankful for his awakening. Who the are you? Answer me. Egron became impatient. At this time, he suddenly discovered another anomaly. The maid spoke not the usual German in the Habsburg court, but French. Are you French? Your Majesty! Please let me take a moment. The maid took a few breaths, and then finally regained her composure. I am the maid who accompanied Princess Sophie, and I came with her from Bavaria. Today she is because of I'm worried, so I'm here to take care of you. So you're a Bavarian? Agron finally understood a little bit. No, Your Majesty, I'm French. The maid shook her head gently. My father was an officer who served in the Imperial Army, and he died in 1815. I fled to Bavaria with my relatives. Your Righteousness brother took us in and took care of us to grow up. It's a pity that a good person like him passed away early. That is to say, she was an orphan of an imperial officer and was taken in by Eugene de Beauharnais, and then came to Schönbrunn Palace as a maid with Princess Sophie, who was married to the Austrian court. Because his thoughts were too complicated, he had a headache. Why call me Your Majesty? To distract his attention, he asked a question that seemed pointless. Because you are Your Majesty. You are the one destined to inherit the empire. The maid replied in a natural tone, besides you, there is no one I need allegiance to. This answer made Egron both surprised and at a loss. Empire, where do I still have an empire? He smiled wryly. No, as long as you are alive, there will be an empire, and we will have it. The maid comforted him anxiously. Your Majesty, I ask you not to lose heart, God will take care of you after all. Egron could hear that her excitement came from the heart. This thought is a little moving. Then what's your name? Agron asked again. My name is Chanel, Your Majesty. The maid stood up, bowed to him, and replied respectfully. Chanel Noel. I have waited for a long time since I came here, and today I finally got the chance. Your Majesty, please let me do my best for you. Your Majesty, please let me do my best for you. Looking at the sincere and tearful maid Chanel, Egron was silent for a moment. The sudden incident made him a little difficult to digest, and he had to think about it carefully. Could this be a test by the Austrians to see if there is any ambition in their minds? He thought first. It shouldn't be. What's the point of this kind of temptation? It's strange that you don't have ambitions, you need some temptation. However, everything has a contingency, and it is too naive to completely trust the other party with only a few words and a few actions. But he wanted to try. The depression and resentment in his heart had accumulated enough, even if there was only a glimmer of hope, he had to try. His current situation is isolated and helpless, and he urgently needs outside help, and even more urgently needs a channel to exchange information. If there is someone who can rely on him and can be trusted, it will be an earth-shaking help. Maybe this is the key step out of the woods. So, he wants to try it no matter what. After making up his mind, he no longer hesitated. "Why are you so loyal to me?" he asked. The maid was slightly surprised. "It is my duty to be loyal to you, after all, my father was also loyal to you." "This is not a very solid reason." Egrin shook his head slightly, and then frowned because of the pain in his body. "Your Majesty." Seeing his pained appearance, the maid hurriedly bowed down and supported his shoulders. With her movement, the long hair under the hood also swept to his arm, and the faint fragrance was transmitted to his nose. But he was unmoved. But more than 10 years ago, almost everyone in France swore allegiance to the Bonaparte family. According to your logic, the new generation of French people will immediately swear allegiance to me, but in reality this is completely impossible. Egrin indifferently said. Looking at Chanel's face, "What is the reason that drives you to be so loyal? What makes you insist on running over from Bavaria, and insist on waiting for so long before running to see me? It stands to reason that you should not have received a wave. The grace of the Nabal family is right." Under Egrin's questioning, Chanel was obviously embarrassed. You, don't you believe me?" she asked cautiously. "I'd love to believe you, but only if you convince me," Egrin replied. "Tell me, what do you want? What's your allegiance to me?" The maid didn't answer. Under the cold light, her fair face was almost transparent, glowing white, and she looked a little pitiful. "Do you want the title of money, or is it purely for the so-called glory? If it is the latter, I advise you not to take risks because of a momentary overheating, which is meaningless to you and very dangerous." Egrin, he continued, "If you want a title of money, then I have nothing to give you right now, and I can't promise you anything. I don't want any of these things, I only have one purpose, Your Majesty." Chanel replied in a low voice. "What?" "For revenge, Your Majesty." Chanel's eyes flashed a little bit of starlight, but there was a little blood in her tone. "I need some people to pay for my family's life and blood." Egrin stopped suddenly. "You just said your father died in 1815. Did he die at Waterloo?" he asked after a moment. "No, Your Majesty." Chanel shook his head. "He didn't die in Waterloo, he died in the country, he died in his hometown. He was lynched, and so did my family." The room was suddenly silent. "Please allow me to finish with you." After a while, Chanel spoke again with tears in his eyes. "I am a Southerner, my father is a retired officer, he did not join the army in 1815, he was tired of fighting, I just wanted to live a peaceful life with my family. But, those bastards, those executioners. They murdered everywhere, and they didn't spare my father, they surrounded our house and burned it down, my parents, my brothers, my neighbors, my relatives are all dead. Only one aunt took me away by chance. How old was I at that time? God knows how much she suffered to take me out of the country. Fortunately, His Royal Highness Ou Ren took us in these orphans, we were lucky enough to settle down, and my aunt passed away soon. Before she died, she told me that we must take revenge and never forgive those sinners." Then, she raised her head and looked at Egrin, her eyes blazing with undisguised fire. "That is the light of vengeance, that is endless hatred. Your Majesty, we will take back the empire. We must kill them all and kill them all. Do you think so?" Egrin did not answer immediately. He believed that what the other party said was true. After all, if anyone can show such real and terrifying hatred in front of her simply by her acting skills, then she must be one of the best actors in history, and such a powerful person is really a condescending talent to be a maid in the palace. So, according to her, her whole family died in the royalist revenge massacre of Napoleonics in the south in 1815. 1815 was a disastrous year. The royalists ruled France. After Napoleon's landing, the 100 Days dynasty was created, and then the royalists fought back. Political chaos will inevitably bring order chaos. In Napoleon Waterloo after the defeat and the second end of the empire, there were retaliatory massacres in several places in France, some bandits and some royalists, but they were just as brutal, just as merciless. This is described in Alexander Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo. Chapter 44 of the original text. Yes, my lord, please forgive me, but, as you will know in a moment, what I have said has been spared no more. At this time, the famous massacre in southern France it happened. There are 2 or 3 rogues, called de Talon, Duzeman, and Grafen, who are openly assassinating, and whoever they think is suspected of being a Napoleonic party is in danger of being killed. You must have heard that. Let's go through this massacre, Your Excellency Count. I vaguely heard that. I was far from France at the time. Let's talk about it. As soon as I entered Nîmes, I literally stepped into a pool of blood, because every step I took I encountered several dead bodies, and the murderous robbers were still killing, looting, and setting fires everywhere. When I saw this kind of killing everywhere and the sight of destruction, I panicked. Not for myself, I'm just an honest Corsican fisherman, nothing to be afraid of, just the opposite, it's the best time for us smugglers, but for the sake of my brother, a soldier of the Empire, who has just returned from the loyal army, his uniform and his epaulets are enough to worry about. I hurried to the innkeeper. My guess is too much. That's right, my brother arrived in Nîmes the night before. He was stabbed to death as soon as he walked to the door of the house where he wanted to stay. I tried my best to find the murderer, but no one dared to kill them. The name told me they were terrified. To be fair, the massacre didn't last long. Although the Bourbon royal family hated the revolutionaries and Bonapartists, they didn't want to see chaos in France, so they quickly stopped the massacre and restored order. Furthermore, when the special commissioners of the Revolutionary Party killed nobles and rebels, and later counter-revolutionaries, they were merciless, and they were also often murdered. In a sense, the 30 years of the Great Revolution were like this. They did not forgive each other, killed each other, and counterattacked again and again, and finally created a whole era of bloodshed. So, to most people this is just a trivial episode in history, a nightmare that has been forgotten and must be forgotten. But for some people, they lost everything. Chanel's family is one of the victims in this little episode. She is full of hatred, and she wants to take revenge, but as a weak woman, she is absolutely powerless, so she wants to restore the empire, use the power of the empire to counterattack again, and send all those enemies to hell. She doesn't care who is right and who is wrong, whoever starts first and who has the most reason to kill, she just wants to pay for her family's blood debt. At this point, she hoped that the empire would be restored more than anyone else. That is to say, she is someone who can be trusted, and she is her hope. So, Your Majesty, you are my only hope. Chanel's words also pulled him out of his thoughts. You can restore the empire, I firmly believe. So I beg you, believe me. Okay, I believe you. Agron finally nodded slightly. I hope to get your help, Chanel. Chanel's eyes widened, and for a moment, the confluence of grief and ecstasy made her beautiful face distorted. Your Majesty. She knelt on the ground almost desperately. Thank you. Be quiet. Agron stopped her. This is not the time to be excited. Tell me what's going on. How long have I been in a coma? What happened in the coma? You were sent back to the palace in the morning, and you have been in a coma for the whole night. The imperial doctor checked your injuries and applied medicine to treat you. Finally, You have been rescued. Sad, she was always with you during the day, and the tears hardly stopped. At night, everyone finally persuaded her to go to rest. When she left, she worried that no one around you would take care of you, so she left me. That's how it happened. Agron finally understood. He didn't expect that he would actually do such a heroic thing. Perhaps, what he told the princess at that time was not a complete lie. In this place, he lacks friends and really doesn't want to see his only friend leave. Maybe not even just as friends. The endless sleepiness and hunger suddenly made him uncomfortable. I'm hungry, find me something to eat. Okay, Your Majesty. Chanel stood up. Wait. In the future, you are not allowed to speak French to me here, and you are not allowed to call me Your Majesty, not even when the two are alone. Agron ordered, the more you form a habit, the easier it is to leak things. I understand, Your Majesty. Chanel smiled, the original pain and sadness swept away. I just said that tonight. After speaking, she walked out of the room and returned with another bowl of broth. Please open your mouth. She pulled up a chair and sat beside Agron. Then, she carefully fed the broth into Egron's mouth. I have to say that although she is not young, she is indeed quite professional. Under her service, Agron feels very comfortable. Thank you. He whispered thanks. No thanks, Your Majesty. It's my honor to serve you. Chanel smiled, then felt wrong. No, Your Majesty. I'm sorry I said it wrong again. Do you think I can truly become His Majesty the Emperor? This question flashed through Egron's mind, but he didn't ask it. Sometimes people need some obsessions to survive. If she believes that the restoration of the empire is impossible today, I am afraid that she will directly collapse in the second. So even for the sake of self-deception, she will be extremely enthusiastic to believe that the empire will be restored, and the day of revenge will definitely come, which is the driving force for her to live. And that's what he can use to help. Because he knows that hatred is more durable, more solid, and more worthy of life than love.